Y desde entonces pues ya hemos mantenido toda una relación en el sentido que es posible a distancia, casi siempre, pero él estuvo aquí ya en una estancia de movilidad en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras y entonces dio unas clases sobre el Quijote y que luego se han hecho un libro, se ha publicado el libro gracias a esas clases, ¿verdad? En realidad, y pues ha podido publicar este libro sobre el Quijote. Y además yo le agradezco siempre que publica algo hace referencia a la Universidad de Navarra y la verdad es que es... Entonces hoy viene en realidad a comentar con nosotros, a contarnos, a ilustrarnos, pero también tiene muchísimo interés en el feedback que nosotros podamos darle, un nuevo libro que algunos de vosotros habéis recibido el manuscrito y que tiene que ver con una cuestión más de teoría social y política, de algún modo, pero que tiene unas raíces que son de tipo filosófico, ¿no? Y por eso tiene mucho interés para nosotros, ¿no? Ya habéis visto los títulos. Pero bueno, él ha publicado muchísimo, es un trabajador infatigable, es un experto en Dante, vamos a decir, ¿no? Y es una de sus... ¿no? Dante es uno de los grandes focos de tu trabajo. De hecho, hace poquísimo ha publicado Dantologies, ¿no? Que es el último libro que has publicado.
Sobre Dante.
Sobre Dante. Theoretical and Theological Terms in Dante Studies. Con el profesor Franke comparto la visión de que no es posible separar completamente el ámbito de lo divino, de lo teológico, del ámbito de la racionalidad, etc. Esto es lo que realmente también nos ha hecho conocernos, etc. Y por eso también tiene muchísimos trabajos sobre lo que es la tradición de la teología negativa, ¿no? Entonces ha hecho varios volúmenes con esa frase de Nicolás de Cusa, what cannot be said, ¿no? Lo que no puede ser dicho, y tiene varios volúmenes viendo cómo gran parte de la tradición de la filosofía sigue en el fondo una tradición de teología negativa, ¿no? Y luego también pues tiene un montón de libros que vosotros podéis ver en la web porque tiene por supuesto una entrada de Wikipedia, pero también A Philosophy of the Unsayable, que también es un libro, a mí es quizás uno de los que más he leído. Y luego hay otra cuestión, y es que el profesor Franke está interesado siempre por el mundo oriental, y por eso también ha sido profesor en Macao. No he dicho, es profesor de literatura comparada en la Universidad de Vanderbilt, en Estados Unidos, pero al mismo tiempo es profesor en Macao, ¿no? Y tiene gran admiración también por el mundo oriental. Pero también
justamente hace parte del apofático, ¿no?
Del apofático.
¿No? Lo que no se puede decir es muy fuerte como tema en China, taoísmo y budismo.
Exacto. Entonces, ¿qué más quería yo decir? Pues también quería decir que también tiene gran admiración por nuestra tradición española.
Sí, Juan de la Cruz, Teresa de Ávila,
San Francisco Javier. O sea, cuando le pregunté la primera vez dónde quería ir de excursión, pues me dijo, pues quiero ir a San Ignacio de Loyola, a ver María, ¿dónde se...? A Loyola, perdón. A Azpeitia. Y también fuimos a ver el Castillo de Javier, porque claro, él oye hablar de Javier en Macao, pero claro, en fin, esto... Y luego otra cosa que quería decir es que más o menos el tópico de esta charla de hoy, él lo dictó por primera vez en el Colegio de los Bernardinos en París, ¿no? ¿No fue en los Bernardinos?
Sí. La primera vez de un aspecto de este tema fue en Kuwait, en el Medio Oriente. Todo ha empezado allá.
En Kuwait.
Sí.
Bueno, entonces ya no hablo más y le dejo a él, pero quería hacer un poco el recorrido porque me parece que, pues que agradecemos muchísimo tu visita a la Universidad de Navarra y tienes la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias.
Lo he hecho en español porque, me siento más fácil para mí. Tú sabes que soy atrevida y podría haberlo hecho en inglés, hasta en alemán, pero...
Sí. No, es muy caliente en este idioma. Y muchísimas gracias a Montserrat. Qué ilusión encontrarme otra vez entre vosotros en esta universidad tan acogedora. Tengo muchísima gratitud. Esta es una gran virtud para Don Quijote también. Gratitud es infinito, es una abertura hacia el indecible. También. No se puede decir la gratitud, se exprime. So, yeah, I'm going to stop with that. Yeah. It's tempting. I love to speak Spanish as much as I'm limited in it, but there was never any question about what this conference. That's not what we say in English. I'm sorry. That's French or conferencia. This seminar, of course, is in English. It's really very much it's an American theme, but it's really very worldwide as well. I think, as Montserrat explained very adroitly, I'm going to talk about this political topic, social justice and social identities, right? Under the banner term of wokeism, but really, I'm taking that as an occasion for thinking this philosophy of the unsayable, which I have applied in various ways to all kinds of topics. Cognitivism, for example, or intercultural philosophy, which Montserrat mentioned as well, or postmodern identity politics. That's really the segue to this current project now on social identities and social justice, rethinking, refounding politics and ethics in the wake of wokeism. Right? That really is my project. Today, I am going to try to concentrate then on this phenomenon of wokeism, to start there and then work over the course of the seminars towards more depth on what really is entailed by this apophatic manner of thinking, which I believe we need desperately in order to deal with our political situation. And the wokeism is so symptomatic of what we're experiencing right now. Of course, everything changes as of today or yesterday, right? Suddenly, wokeism is on the defensive, right? I've been working on this project in just the opposite key, right? Where it was conquering the world in so many ways, and starting with the university in America, but then branching out worldwide, even in the Middle East. That was tracking global wokeism. That was the first conference in Kuwait. Now exactly 2 years ago. So in this period, there has been quite an offensive on the part of this culture. We could really date it back maybe to 2011 is when it really began going strong. But we have now a 180-degree turnabout, right, in the politics of the American government. And that really does change the picture in some ways. It doesn't really affect my arguments. I'm not on one side or the other at all. I'm trying to understand really how these polarities work, and it doesn't really matter which side is dominant, but it does change how what I say is heard, the context into which it's being broadcast now. So with that, I do want to then start working through this reflection on this phenomenon, the woke revolution, and the way in which it founds social power on victimhood, right? This is really sort of the first section. And we are witnessing today a social and a cultural revolution whose shorthand name is woke. And this term resonates, of course, with awake in English. It was originally coined by Black Americans who became acutely aware of racial discrimination. And they used this term woke in order to signal their politically and socially awakened consciousness. A deeper historical genealogy of the woke movement might be traced from the 18th century Enlightenment in Europe, which culminates in revolution, right, signaled in 1789 with the French Revolution. And I think that today we've been repeating this historical cycle, moving from Enlightenment to revolution. But specifically in our own era, we're witnessing the revolution of the victims. There is, if you want to show that's the title of one of these books. What is it? This book has been important. Bruce Bauer, The Rise of Identity Studies and the Birth of Woke Ideology. I think that is an important starting point, I have to say, for my own reflections. So, good, thank you. That's enough then. So, the proponents of the woke cause demand rights for the oppressed. Political and social power are exercised or claimed in the name of our civilization's victims and casualties. And this revolution has been remarkably and almost miraculously successful. For society today, nothing counts as more sacred than the victim. Defending or taking up the cause of victims justifies everything, every use or abuse of power. The same logic is used even by the Russian and Chinese leaders and the North Korean and Iranian regimes in their bids for power. Their political and cultural agendas aim to liberate the world considered as the victim of the West, both historically and currently. However, the ideology of victimhood, validated by the woke movement, originates first from inside Western society as a revolution or movement of contestation within its bosom, before threatening and attacking it from outside. It's self-critique. Why does this mentality attract such fervent supporters and have such a seductive effect on so many? Many join, or at least sympathize with this moral revolution so as to feel good about themselves, to ward off the onus of guilt in a world that seems to be unbearably unjust. Especially privileged young people find relief in declaring their alignment with what are recognizably woke ethics. Identifying as anti-racist, feminist, pro-LGBTQ, etc., is the way to portray oneself as moral and socially acceptable in many mainstream milieus today. And such public profiling is now appropriately called virtue signaling. Adhering to some form of wokeism can be understood as an attempt to exonerate oneself of blame in a world that is felt to be shamefully unfair and immoral. Professing politically correct allegiances serves as balsam for wounds of a sorely hurting conscience. At least this explains a certain surface of this widespread sociological phenomenon. More subliminally, identifying a guilty and responsible party not only alleviates moral anguish, effecting a kind of emotional catharsis, it also seems to promise a solution for fixing what is wrong with society. The culprit, according to wokeist discourses, is identified in the Western white male as subjugator, dominator, and exploiter. From the Crusades in the Middle Ages, and imperialism and colonialization in the modern period to contemporary capitalism, this identity, concretely the heterosexual white man, who is ruthless, greedy, destructive, and predatory, is to blame for most of the world's woes. And so we have the scapegoat needed as foundation for the grand narrative that re-envisions all of world history from a revolutionary woke perspective. Such scapegoating is potentially a more sinister aspect of the woke revolution. Wokeness is founded on an ethical political sensibility that I believe is certainly correct and morally right. It appeals to noble principles of equity and equal dignity for all. But how is this ethical appeal being played out today and institutionalized? It results in condemnations or pardons according to social identities. The path to power in a culture steeped in wokeness lies in declaring oneself to be a victim of the dominant group, or better yet, in simply identifying with apparently oppressed minorities in publicly declared outspoken solidarity. Various sorts of abstract self-identification are producing effects of intolerance, belligerence, and incivility. In the name of such identities, nominally liberal societies prove perfectly capable of producing phenomena of coercion or intimidation against their own ideals of free speech and expression. These values are in crisis among us. Strident debates on pertinent issues confront us with deep dilemmas. Student protests and their repression issue an unacceptable violence and appalling disrespect. How can we not condemn hateful, inflammatory, anti-Semitic, or otherwise racist speech? Can an open society tolerate intolerance? But how can we dictate to citizens what they must say and think to be politically correct? All right, to attempt to approach the nerve of this issue, I begin by telling a story. It goes back to George Floyd, right? And that incident, the story, which I heard somewhere, I present it as an invention. I work a lot with invention, as you know, invention, poetic, myth, prophecy. It includes fantasy and the Quixote as well. All of this is as being revelatory, having powers really that do become revelatory. So, that's to justify moving into a slightly fictive mode, but it's actually very much grounded in what happened. The story is about the police commissioner in New York who was invited to a college campus to give a speech. He was booed and had to leave the podium, shouted down, removed from campus, because what he wanted to say that if you really believe that Black Lives Matter, right, which rose up in the wake of the George Floyd killing, you shouldn't be defunding the police. There was a 75% reduction in New York City with the crackdown on gangs in the previous year. This is what this police commissioner was trying to put across. So Floyd's horrendous murder became a motive and an alibi for lawlessness and violence. It became the symbol of Black victimization by the police, which exists and is reprehensible. But this event triggered a reaction that in turn incited to violence, delirium, and a dangerous spiral of racial tensions. The Floyd incident was elevated by woke political agendas to an unprecedented level of prominence as an emblem of all-pervasive racism. Floyd's killing was taken as the epitome of the racism of an entire society. Yet the policeman, Derek Chauvin, he's an American, who killed Floyd, had no history of racism. In the trial, there was no evidence that he was racist or despised people of color. Nothing on this issue was raised by the prosecution, and it could hardly have remained unnoticed and unexamined if it had existed. Chauvin's act was not a racist crime, but was taken as a symbol of precisely that by those who wanted to signal their condemnation of racism, and also perhaps incentivize angry mobs intent on looting and vandalism, right? Portland, Seattle, and other cities bear the scars. Now, this is an illustration of how the media and political networks that are largely beholden to certain ideologies and entrenched camps seize upon certain facts that trigger powerful emotions to create a movement that all too easily loses its sense of reality and suppresses respect for truth. Emotional reaction can be motivated by the passion for an ideal that is very good in itself, but is metamorphosed into a myth and exploited to incite further violence and to nourish resentment and anger. In highly tense and fraught situations, especially today, propaganda on all sides proliferates at alarming rates unchecked, given the unprecedented and technological means of its dissemination in contemporary culture. There are, of course, innumerable instances of such strategic abuse and distortion also on the other end of the political spectrum. Violently destructive mob behavior is at least as likely to erupt in the anti-woke camp. ignited by, well, there was this incident in Southport, England, right? It was Taylor Swift themed public dance, and she was there were maybe 5 young ladies knifed to death. The immigrant background of the killer was distorted out of all proportion, and really then did trigger lots of outbursts, and another cause célèbre. As any incident can be weaponized for this type of ideological warfare, and truth is the first victim. The name George Floyd commemorates a horrific, inexcusable incident, but to take it as representative of all American society and of the history of the West as a whole, as the true revelation of the quintessence of this civilization, as was often the case in the heat and fury of the protest and revolt, is a mythification. Like almost any other revolutionary political movement, the woke revolution is susceptible of perpetrating such distortions. Meanwhile, it is forgotten that Western civilization has done more than perhaps any other to combat and curb racism, which exists in virtually all civilizations, historically and currently. Slavery was abolished first by the British Empire, 1807, and then in the USA at the cost of a harrowing civil war. The Floyd event became an organizing symbol, like the storming of the Bastille that sparked the French Revolution. It also raised a rallying cry for much peaceful protest and popular revolt. People of all races and ages came together in harmoniously affirming their common commitment to an anti-racist ideal. And this was an uplifting, edifying sight to behold. Nonetheless, the Floyd incident was also used to justify and motivate the cultural revolution that is fostered and fomented by a new woke clergy, a certain clerical class of professors and administrators and politicians and influencers of all kinds in the media and on social networks. There can be no precise definition of who or what is woke. Yet this apparently new and revolutionary sensibility translates into political action, legislation, and cultural reform. The demands for decolonization, anti-racism, anti-sexism, gay and trans rights, etc., have in fact swept through institutions and policymaking at all levels and become tacit, difficult to resist litmus tests by which we judge and are judged. My point in mentioning the late regretted Mr. Floyd is not to defend police racism, which is a terribly serious problem. It's soul-shattering, especially in its extension to the prison system. But making people believe that police everywhere attack blacks gratuitously because they are black and with impunity is a false fabrication instrumentalized by interested power-mongering parties to discredit and destroy an entire civilization. Derek Chauvin was condemned to life imprisonment. His act was not condoned or excused or adjudged legitimate or normative or held up as an example to be emulated by other police officers. And there's another very similar case of a man who, under arrest, died. He was pushed to the ground, and a police officer put his knee in his back, and 14 minutes later, when whatever arrived to take him away, he was dead. And his last words were very similar to the famous "I can't breathe. You are killing me. I need medication." Right? He was on drugs like Floyd. That's a Freudian slip, literally. And this man, you've probably never heard of Tony Timpa. He was about the same age, 30 years old. He was white. And of the 5 policemen involved in his arrest and decease, 3 have returned to active duty, and 2 are now honorably retired. George Floyd is not an isolated case. There's much discrimination in police action and everywhere in society, but it is not only or always deliberately against blacks, women, gays, etc. To treat violence in terms of social identities, and see, I'm not really interested in which side is being privileged or condemned. To treat violence in terms of social identities compounds rather than resolves it, because social identities as such are neither victims nor perpetrators, they are abstractions. And although these characteristics count and are real in numberless specific contexts, to base particular judgments on them is to cede to prejudice. It involves invidious generalizing and an abstract mode of reasoning that is bound to commit injustice against individuals and also against groups. We erect stereotyped images that serve to funnel the passions of mobs into various types of action, including war, setting up specific groups over against others. Right? It's every bit as evident in our identities, our national identities. You know, we can demonize Germans or Japanese or Russians or Chinese or Americans. To form a harmonious human community, we need instead not to fixate on such identities, much less on categories such as Jews or homosexuals or women, and especially not on such labels as markers of power differentials, because they divide us by an oppositional logic rather than uniting various groups in ways that enable them to celebrate true human diversity.